questions. So we get to our second keynote, and I'm happy to introduce Ayse Coskun, who is a full professor in the Electrical and Computer Engineering department at Boston University, where she's leading the Performance and Energy-Aware Computing Lab, and also Ayse is the director of the Center for Information and Systems Engineering at Boston University. And yeah, today we hear your keynote on AI's energy challenge. Can data center power grid coordination offer a path to sustainability? Provoking title, I'd say. Yeah, thank you much for being here. And the stage is yours. Yeah, no, you're unmuted. Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and you can see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Thank you all for joining. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there due to a conflicting trip. And I was also running not to be late for my talk, so I'm a little bit like catching my breath. Sorry about that. So today I'm going to talk about the AI energy demand and whether data center power grid coordination could offer a path to sustainability. So you might be seeing various anecdotes and data online in the news, even these days, about data center energy cost or energy consumption. This map shows globally the density of data centers, and totally globally, we are a little bit north of 500 terawatt hours estimated total data center energy usage right now. So that's a huge number, but it's also growing. And this growth has been due to data centers basically being at the backbone of everything we are doing, from data analysis to user apps to scientific research. And if you look at specific anecdotes, this is the Frontier supercomputer. It's one of the top supercomputers in the US. It consumes about 30 megawatts in peak power, and the electricity cost reaches $40 million annually. This is just the electricity bill, basically, not including all the other operational costs. Now, this is a modest data center at this point. There are also quite a few hyperscalers that these days we are talking about hundreds of megawatts of consumption per data center in some scenarios. So this latest surge that led to sustainability being even more urgent and energy related news being on main channels has been due to the growth in AI. So AI has become pervasive, especially due to the success of large language models. And this is driving larger infrastructures, more data centers, and overall larger power consumption. This estimate is from McKinsey from last year. It appeared in Washington Post earlier this year. And it shows the estimated amount of energy that needs to be added in gigawatts to the United States power grid. So if a gigawatt is roughly the amount of power of a large nuclear power plant, we see that, estimating another 10 gigawatts being added over the next decade, we can see that it's really a huge challenge. And this estimate changes. I've seen estimates that mention 30, 40 gigawatts even within the next decade. So some estimates are more even showing more need for growth. And then I was just reading yesterday that because this growth is not going to be easy, there's going to be limitations on AI data centers as soon as 2027, which is just around the corner. So this is another similar plot. This plot is showing data center electricity consumption growth in the US, and this came from the Electric Power Research Institute a few months ago. And there are different scenarios: low growth, high growth. The low growth is pre-ChatGPT, so to speak. So before AI became really pervasive in many applications. So that's no longer a viable scenario. Moderate growth, high growth scenarios put the 2030 electricity consumption of data centers to 5 to 7% of the United States. Now, the important thing is that this growth is huge. The power grid is already strained, but also that blue region over there, that already happened. That growth has already happened, right? So overall, generally, we've been talking about a substantial need for data centers over the years, but the growth has been somewhat steady. But now we are in this region where we add more data centers, we add more applications, we have more uses for them every day. Now, I mean, as we are based in the US, we look at the US a lot, but this is not US specific, obviously. It's a widespread problem or a challenge across many countries. And if you look across how the electricity is being consumed, we also see not a homogeneous distribution. And in the US, for instance, some states have a lot higher percentage of electricity going into data centers. This dark blue area is Virginia, as an example. That's home to the data center alley. And the current electricity consumption of data centers already reached 20% and is projected to grow even further. There are many other examples like this. Ireland's electricity consumption is estimated 15 to 20% is going to data centers, as BBC reported earlier this year. So this kind of consolidated or clustered growth adds more challenges for these areas in terms of the power grid, in terms of the impact of local communities, in terms of overall sustainability of computing and data centers. So where is this energy going to come from? We need a lot of new energy. So when we look into across the world globally, all countries have decarbonization goals. And the top figure, and this is from New York Times last year, top figure shows different countries and regions, and the axes are not scaled. So it's basically showing for each country the distribution between clean power versus fossil fuel power. The bottom graph is exactly the same graph, it's just drawn to scale, right? So when we see, I mean, the promising part is that the clean power generation has been growing everywhere almost, right? In these four examples at this US, EU, UK, Australia. There are other regions like China where the fossil fuel power is still growing substantially. But in these cases, like there's growth, so that's good news. However, when we look at the bottom graph, for instance, in the case of United States, still over 2 million gigawatt hours of energy generation relies on fossil fuels. And now with this unprecedented growth in data centers, a lot of power providers are saying that they may not be able to turn off their gas plants or coal plants even because they are under strain to meet this demand, and adding new clean power is challenging due to a variety of reasons. So what does an electric grid do? One of the things it does is to balance supply against the demand. And this is really challenging already, but it becomes even more challenging in the intermittent nature of clean energy. So wind power, solar power, they are intermittent by nature. Sun doesn't shine every day, wind doesn't blow every day. So for instance, I was visiting Iowa recently. Their wind energy goes from like tens of gigawatts in the windy season to less than 200 megawatts in the not windy season. So there's a substantial gap in the energy change. And this kind of change, daily, weekly, monthly trends, brings additional strain to the grid. And we don't have large-scale, green, cheap batteries to help balance this out, although a lot of the grid infrastructures are adding more batteries all over. However, it's not going to be sufficient to solve the scale of the problem. So one mechanism that has been introduced over the last couple of decades in the grid to help with the supply-demand match problem is demand response. Basically, there are a variety of programs, and the idea of demand response is to subscribe to a program where the power provider tells the consumer to regulate its power up and down, depending on what's happening in the grid. Perhaps it needs to integrate more renewables. Perhaps it needs to manage peak demand better. For instance, in summer months, in a lot of countries, heat goes up. A lot more people use ACs. The energy demand goes up. So it becomes more challenging to balance supply and demand. So demand response helps with this, because then the power grid has a lot of consumers, ideally, that can regulate their power at different time scales. And it's a complex optimization problem to solve, but overall it gives more flexibility. Now, what we've been working on in my team is to position data centers as well-suited demand response participants. So what does that mean? So as opposed to data center just demanding power and consuming power, it could become a flexible load on the grid. So then the grid can provide, depending on the program, a signal to the data center to follow, regulate its power up and down. And data center can do this because of its inherent power flexibility, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then data center gets incentives, monetary incentives for doing this. And overall grid can provide more clean energy, can do better peak management, and overall supply demand match becomes easier to manage. So an important constraint here, though, is performance. So a data center's primary concern for primary business concern is performance. So it has to keep its users happy, otherwise the users, consumers will go elsewhere. So let's look into some specific examples to see what demand response means. So in this scenario, we are looking into a regulation signal example from the New York ISO, New York Independent Service Operator. And this is a regulation service reserves demand response mechanism, where the power signal changes on the order of every few seconds. And the consumer, in this case, a data center, is supposed to follow that within some error margin. If it can manage to follow this, given some constraints, like I was saying, then it's going to get reimbursed for the regulation reserve capacity it can provide. So it's going to pay for the average power consumption, the P bar in this case, and it's going to get reimbursed in proportion to the regulation capacity it can provide. For instance, data center can be on average 50 megawatts of consumption kind of data center, but then it provides, let's say, 10 megawatt up and down regulation capacity. So overall electricity cost will be reduced proportional to the reserve capacity. This is one example that is hypothetical example, but a lot of people are looking into these things these days. There are other real world examples. Google has been doing demand response pilots in Europe by shifting non-urgent compute to different times, basically doing temporal shifting of workload. Lawrence Livermore, which has a supercomputer in the US, provided in the previous summer a demand flexibility of 8 megawatts during a heat wave to the power provider. Like I was mentioning earlier, heat wave means that everybody is using their ACs more, and energy becomes more scarce. And in this case, Lawrence Livermore provided flexibility. We put together taxonomy of data center demand response programs and implementation approaches recently. So there are various price programs. There's a lot of work going into how to price these things better so that they are more attractive. My research doesn't go into that topic, but if you are interested, there's certainly interesting new happenings over there. And so that's one area. We mostly look into incentive programs. I was talking about demand response, for instance, regulation service reserve markets before. They are market programs. There are ancillary services, capacity markets, and these have different values and different rules depending on the region. And they exist all over the world, from Australia to various European countries have different flavors of demand response programs. And sometimes there's also emergency demand response, which is also worth thinking about. Emergency demand response means that the grid has, no way but to ask some consumers to reduce power or to require. And in these cases, actually, there are some opportunities to do, more efficient power regulation on the data center side. And on the bottom here, you see a bunch of DR implementation approaches. Demand response implementation can be done by optimization, load shedding, power capping. Forecasting is a component of how much flexibility can the data center provide type of questions, looking into auctions, workload scheduling, etc. So why is data center a good target for doing this? Because compared to many other electricity consumers, data centers have a lot of inherent flexibility. Given a power target that's dynamically changing, we can increase processor power or decrease processor power in our servers. Hardware, CPUs or GPUs come with already ability to run at different power levels. And we can change the number of servers we are running. Often data centers are not close to their 100% utilization level. So there's some room for changing the number of servers we are using. And not everything we run in the data center is urgent, so we can run fewer jobs or more jobs depending on the constraints we have. So we get a lot of questions about performance typically. Sure, there are urgent workloads. If you are doing a bank financial transaction, you may need like very low latency, but not everything we run is in that category. So for instance, batch loads, workloads that run for hours or days at a time, often the users are not very sensitive to the performance. If I'm running a simulation to do some, scientific computation, if my simulation is going to take 5 hours, maybe I don't mind as much if it's taking 5 hours and 5 minutes. And maybe at times it's slower, at times it's faster, right? So there's a lot of flexibility coming from the workloads, and we have a lot of control knobs to implement that flexibility. So what we have envisioned is a demand response software suite. Part of it is forecasting and bidding in power markets. So this part is basically understanding what kind of properties data center has in terms of its hardware, how many nodes, what kind of hardware, what kind of workload, what kind of power do I need to consume in my data center for the next hour so that I can deliver on my performance targets. So that's forecast and bidding. And the second part is a framework that is going to control the job scheduling and power management to implement the data center's power regulation program. So basically, as the power signal is changing, data centers should be able to follow it closely, even if not perfectly. So the secret sauce here is to put together a data center model. Without losing generality, we look into data center workloads as a queuing model. So different types of jobs are queued together. So Q1 would be one type of job, Q2 would be another type of job, and these type of jobs would have different performance constraints. Some could be more urgent, some could be less urgent. And given this mathematical model, we first determine the average power and reserve amount for the next hour based on a statistical forecast of what kind of workloads we are expecting. And then at runtime, as the power target rises and drops, then we first increase the number of active servers and then do scheduling and power capping decisions. So in addition to simulations, we also designed a prototype at the Massachusetts Green High Performance Computing Center. And this was a modest-sized prototype, but it was really nice to show the demand response idea in operation. So we put together 36 servers, and we implemented the power regulation through Intel's RAPL. These are CPU servers, so and they were Intel servers, so they had Intel RAPL. And we put a linear power model to estimate the power of the entire server. And we ran a variety of applications from NAS parallel benchmark suite, which is mimicking HPC-style workloads, basically batch workloads. And we generated a variety of different workload scenarios. We also implemented the framework software architecture in a primary client type of hierarchical architecture. So the primary talks to the regulation signal, then decides whether to start jobs or set power caps. And then depending on the job status and server power, it makes adjustments. And the clients are basically, they are just running jobs and applying the power cap if any power cap is given to them. So we ran a variety of workloads. This is one example. This 36 servers were consuming around 10 kilowatts. And this is before demand response participation. Jobs come and then they just run. There's no power management here. And then when we provide the target power in the demand response scenario, our framework enables the cluster to follow that red signal closely while delivering on the performance guarantees it promised to its users. So we ran both in the prototype and also in our simulations, a variety of scenarios, short applications, longer applications, lower power, higher power, mix of workloads, having more slack quality of service or tighter quality of service. Overall, the results were very promising. We saw between 30 and 50%, but mostly, between 30 and 35% capacity opportunities. What does that mean? That means if the data center is consuming 10 megawatts, it has the opportunity to provide 3 to 4 megawatts of that back to the grid as flexible capacity. And it would reduce its energy cost in this way because it would get a proportional electricity cost reduction. But more importantly, on the grid side, this flexibility is going to enable adding greener energy and having a more stable grid overall. So this vision goes beyond specific demand response programs, although I believe that's immediate gain that one can provide through a framework like this. We call this a flexible data center. So like I mentioned, there's the bidding planning component, which is understanding the workload and forecasting what kind of power consumption the data center has to have to meet its performance targets while providing regulation capacity. The second aspect is flexible computing and implementing this all the way onto the servers so that we can effectively use the data center control knobs, such as scheduling and power capping, to enable this flexible computing. The third component that I haven't talked about is potentially collaborating among data centers. It could be data centers of the same company where by shifting workload, but also it could be solely collaborating by exchanging some aggregate data and absorbing the volatility of the data centers, uncertainty in workload and volatility of the clean energy generation in the grid. So multiple data centers can talk together and do demand response together, basically, and we have some recent work in that space. And finally, the implementation of this has to be scalable. Data centers are very performance sensitive. So we put together this hierarchical framework for prototyping, but definitely there's more room to scale it up to thousands of servers and having the opportunity to do flexible computing without hurting performance. Now, this can be applied for demand response. It can also be applied for data centers with on-site behind-the-meter green energy generation, like in the middle example. If the data center has some amount of on-site energy, it can also use this kind of framework to help plan for that. And finally, there could be new carbon-aware optimizations coming up in the future, new markets potentially, and new pricing mechanisms. Again, this kind of a flexible framework can help with that. So there's increasing amount of talk about flexible computing, and flexible operation is possible while providing quality of service guarantees to users. This is the critical part. Flexible operation in computers, it always has been possible, but the big challenge is to provide not just decent performance, but performance guarantees for certain workloads, and this is entirely possible. The low-hanging fruit, the immediate gains would be in batch loads, including some AI workloads, in my opinion. But I think broadly in the cloud space, there are opportunities to provide flexible execution models also to users, where perhaps the user fees can be affected by whether they adopt some flexibility in their execution or not. So many opportunities exist to implement this. Like I mentioned, an open research area where we started putting some thought in is how to do collaborative optimization. What if there are multiple data centers in the same region? And there are many cases of this, like I was saying, some states and countries have a really high percentage of electricity going into data centers. So can we enable collaborative optimization, potentially abiding by some privacy constraints for data sharing among data centers? And finally, I think overall this feeds into a broader vision to jointly optimize for electricity among load aggregators, data centers, and potentially other flexible consumers in the grid. Thank you for listening. And I don't know if we have time, but I can take some questions.
Amazing. Thank you very much. So I would start with like 1 or 2 online questions if they're there, and then maybe we can pass over to the in-person attendees. So there's been one talk on how you would address rebound effects, although I'm personally not quite sure what rebound effects exactly are meant. Here, how does this approach avoid the pitfalls of the rebound effect?
I think it mentions the Jevons paradox. Basically, if I'm understanding correctly, when something becomes more efficient, and then sometimes it gets used more. Perhaps it's mentioning maybe that's the question. I mean, I can answer with that in mind, I guess. So I think here I'm not too concerned about rebound effects in this case, because what we are looking at is not solely efficiency. So typically rebound effects happen in terms of the Jevons paradox, which basically says that sometimes the technology gets more efficient, but then its sustainability or usage is worse because everybody uses it more, right? So once I produce a cell phone that's super efficient, then maybe I sell like 100 million of them. So efficiency is necessary, but it's not sufficient in the data center space. For these type of demand response programs, overall, I'm not too concerned about the rebound effect. I think overall, if everybody was flexible, then grid has a much easier time to balance things out, and they can bring in actually more energy generation. So the energy intermittent nature of energy, green energy, is a big challenge. There is like new energy that's waiting to be connected in a number of locations. The intermittency is not the only problem. Transmission networks is also a problem. But overall, I don't see an immediate problem. In the long run, like if everybody is doing demand response, I think the bigger problem over there is the incentives. This is a problem now. It's going to be a problem in the future. What's going to incentivize data centers to actually do this? Monetary cost is one thing, but generally a lot of the bigger entities in this space are not too concerned about the cost aspect of things. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I tried to the best of my understanding of the question.
Yeah, maybe I can squeeze in a quick question. So have you ever applied this in like actual systems? Because I know that at least in Germany, our grids are embarrassingly dumb. Like there's nothing is digitalized. People actually don't really know where there are grid congestions. Like there's no real metering. Everything is based on estimates. So there are demand response programs for like emergency cases when you actually measure frequency drops or something, then of course you tell the big consumers to stop, but it's not very granular. It's not that you say use a bit more, use a bit less. How do you know how the situation in your US is, if you have like smarter grids, or do you actually have the data to do this?
Yeah, so it's very region specific. There are a number of, so in the US it's like semi-privatized, so different regions are controlled by different independent service operators. For example, in the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland markets, New York market, power market, Texas, ERCOT, California, and also in the Midwest and MISO, they have already demand response mechanisms. It varies in terms of the value, in terms of the usage, like how many consumers are engaging in it, but they exist already. In Europe, Norway, I've been looking into the case of Norway because we have a project with Norwegian institutions. And over there seems to be some opportunities. Australia has been doing a lot of demand response. I believe in Northern European countries where the green energy is more ambitiously adopted, there's more discussion about demand response. So real world examples exist certainly. However, like I was saying, one challenge is not just the availability of these programs and the renovation that's needed in the grid, but also incentivizing the data centers in the right way so that they do this. While these programs exist, and some consumers do the demand response, data centers have been not really doing this. Now there's a lot more discussion because of the capacity problem, basically. Because the grid is at a point where it can't provide easily hundreds of megawatts to new data centers. So then now there's more discussion about how to implement flexibility, and there are new initiatives. So I think we'll see more, but certainly there are challenges. But I think the immediate challenges are more in getting the data centers to easily do this. And on the grid side, certainly a lot of areas can use renovation in the grid in terms of measurements and getting data. But even in, like I was saying, even in cases where there is a more renovated grid and there's more data, there are some gaps in communication, I think, between the data centers, consumers, and the grid. Does it make sense? I did answer your question. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks a lot.